today's symposium is the role of national museums in renegotiating or negotiating national identity. And the Chester Beatty Library thought long and hard about what would be our contribution to the Ireland 2016 commemorations. And we decided we were going to explore themes around culture and identity. And we wanted to specifically generate a debate amongst museum professionals in the Chester Beatty, inviting our colleagues from all over Ireland to come and talk and explore issues around what museums are doing or what perhaps they should be doing in reflecting the makeup of today's Ireland. And of course today's Ireland is not the same as Ireland was 20, 50, 100 years ago. We've rapidly seen a growth in a multicultural society, and we wanted to explore whether that is actually being reflected in what our museums are doing today.
The National Museums has a special position because they are the legitimate voice of a mutual understanding of both the historic fate of the nation, but also of a package of values that are reproduced and communicated through the National Museum. It's hard to think of the making of nation and states without national museums, because national museums are there to demonstrate and to communicate and to negotiate the relationship between the nation and the states. And if they hadn't been there, they would have been invented somehow.
The themes of identity and migration are important for the House of European History because they're 2 of 5 to 7 themes that we work on, and they're important because they can show the diversity of experience across the European continent. And it fitted with today's conference at the Chester Beatty Library, looking at the diversity of cultures. So we brought different types of materials such as letters, ephemera, posters and objects themselves to work with the concept of how you could use in an Irish museum context different sources to talk about diversity and migration. Migration and identity, often they're 2 themes that are seen to be interlinked in many ways. So both in flux, very contemporary issues for Europeans as much as for Irish people. So from the perspective of the House of European History, they're something that can be looked at with a past historical sense of what happened with migration tied to the issues to today. And this is the thing we'd hoped in the workshop that we carried out, that this could be explored through the use of materials, not just at the House of European History, but any museum can work with these themes in a broad way.
The workshop we did today, we collaborated with the House of European History, and the theme we found in common between the House of European History and the Chester Beatty Library was migration and identity. And we brought these 2 key themes to our workshop participants who work within the Irish Museum context or our students of MA Cultural Policy. Migration and identity are common themes. They're universal. They're not confined to one particular group or groups. And if you come into the Chester Beatty Library, you'll find that objects from the collections have a shared history. They've been made in one place, they've travelled somewhere else, and they've been in the possession of maybe a third party. It's not something that's confined historically. Migration history is common right throughout our histories, even to today. And you'll see that with the current crisis in Europe at the moment and the Middle East. So for museums, we do have a very strong role to play when collecting conversations, as is the name of our workshop, Collective Conversations. And it was very reflective in the discussions that we had today with our participants when they worked with objects both from the House of European History and the Chester Beatty Library.
Religious nature, how would you relate them to the Irish
We have a shared narrative, but we know not everybody's bought into the shared narrative. So this year, we have to look out to see what happens. But there's examples of fantastic practice. And one that I recently learnt about is in the Nerve Centre in Derry, where they're looking at the sort of the messiness of our history. So they're looking at first families who have two brothers in the First World War from Catholic side, for example, sort of trying to break the traditional view of who participated in the First World War. And they're finding descendants from people who joined the British Army who then became active in the Republican movement in the city. So they're just showing that we don't have one history, that we all have these multiple stories, and we might promote one history because it's useful, and we might hide one, you know. So that's the sort of thing that some institutions are embracing and exploring with great success.
Well, the 1916 exhibition that the museum is putting on this year is the 8th iteration of the story the museum has told since 1932. And as well, the challenge is for this new audience, for 21st century audiences, to make the events of Easter Week 1916 relevant to people today. So what we've tried to do is, instead of dealing with the main narrative relating to the leaders, who obviously figure, but also concentrating on stories that people can relate to, stories around civilians, stories around women, stories around children. And you have stories such as Charles Darcy, who was 15 years old when he went out and was shot on the first day of the Easter Rising. And it's just, particularly people, if you actually try and address what a 15-year-old or 9-year-old boy today, for example, what they would have done in those kind of circumstances, and just to reflect on that that experience.
In a sense, if you want to crystallise or encapsulate what the essence of a national cultural policy was for Irish nationalists after independence, it is captured in that extraordinary statement of Eamon de Valera's, that when he wants to understand what the Irish people wants, all he has to do is to look into his own heart. What he means is there's a community of feeling there, that what he feels is being simultaneously felt by others. So you have this perfect communion, but this perfect communion is only with a particular, shall we say, highly selective version of Irish history. And in the last 20 years, our identity has changed even more profoundly by the fact that now 12% of the people who live here are not Irish born and are likely to have children who are going to have hybridized Irish and hyphenated other identities. There's quite a strong statement in there about the need to look across society, to look across it not only in terms of its ethnic makeup, but also in terms of our institutional structures, to make sure that we're embracing this change as effectively as we can, so that we can construct credible images of contemporary Irish society for ourselves. I think that's the essential challenge we have. How do we, even using historical materials, conduct credible images of ourselves in the 21st century?
One of the things that we were talking about was this whole notion of identity and migration, and it's clear that migration and identity are very complex and fluid things, and museums tend to work with artefacts which, while they may well be able to be reinterpreted, quite often we need to be perhaps more proactive in collecting and a little bit more nimble in dealing with some of the changes within constituent populations, because things are moving so fast now, and museums will need probably in the future to move faster and maybe create more things digitally online, or engage with more dialogue with people in order to understand how they're thinking and feeling, because we can't anymore just think that museums are going to tell people who they are and what they should think they are. Now people come in, they've got multiple identities, they've got multiple ways of thinking about themselves, they're looking for themselves in museums, particularly national museums. If they don't find themselves there, they'll be very disappointed. And so I think it's incumbent now on all museums to think much more carefully about consulting with the groups of people that they feel they represent, to make sure that they are representing them in the way in which they would like to be.